Hello and welcome to the second lecture of Søren Kierkegaard, Subjectivity, Irony, and the Crisis of Modernity. In the first lecture, we learned that there were a number of important aspects of the thought of Socrates that were a great inspiration for Kierkegaard. We talked about Socratic irony, the idea of aporia, Socrates' role as the gadfly of Athens, Socrates' daimon, and finally, Socrates' so-called maieutic art. It was useful to see these concepts in their original context in Plato's dialogues, since this will give us a greater appreciation for Kierkegaard's unique use of them. But we still have one brief errand to attend to before we get to this. Kierkegaard's understanding of Socrates was, of course, based on his reading of the texts of Plato, Xenophon, and Aristophanes, that is, the primary Greek sources. But it was also largely shaped by the interpretation of the famous German philosopher Hegel, with whom he was in a constant critical dialogue in the concept of irony. Hegel's philosophy was a highly popular trend at the University of Copenhagen in the late 1830s when Kierkegaard was a student and was writing this work. So in this lecture, we'll explore first the presence of Hegel at the university during Kierkegaard's time, and then we'll go through Hegel's analysis of Socrates, treating the same topics that we introduced last time, that is, Socratic irony, aporia, the daimon, and so forth. We'll see how Kierkegaard is inspired and influenced by the important historical role that Hegel ascribes to the person of Socrates. What does it mean to say that we are autonomous? For most people today, autonomy is just a fancy word for freedom. Literally, autonomy just means that one is able to give a law to oneself. In other words, one can decide for oneself what one wishes to do. So to say that someone is not autonomous means that that person is subject to external laws that often contradict what one wants to do. So in this sense, we all generally think that autonomy is a good thing, just as we think that freedom is a good thing. I don't want someone telling me what to do or imposing arbitrary rules and regulations on me that limit my freedom. Today, autonomy is conceived as a universally positive thing, but this was not always the case. In some societies, the main value was not for people to go out and act on their own desires and wishes. Instead, the most important thing was for them to follow a set of rules that had been agreed upon by one's family, culture, or society. This includes dressing in a certain way or acting in accordance with accepted norms. According to this view, to act autonomously is a sign of arrogance and disregard for one's family or tradition. This is often associated with religion. For example, in religious ceremonies, everyone is expected to do the same thing, to perform the same ceremony in the same way. It's impossible to be an individualist or a nonconformist in a ceremonial context. Moreover, in Christianity, it's thought that human beings are finite and sinful. They're only able to gain salvation not by their own acts alone, but by the grace of God. It's therefore considered not just arrogant, but even irreligious to act as if one could determine the truth for oneself. In this sense, autonomy is conceived as a negative thing. This issue, which is still very much alive today, was one that was important in Kierkegaard's time. It was thematized by a young Danish scholar named Hans Lassen Martensen. When Kierkegaard was a student here at the University of Copenhagen in the 1830s, the philosophy of the German philosopher Hegel became a major trend among students. The key figure for the popularity of Hegel was Martensen, who was just 5 years older than Kierkegaard. In 1836, Martensen returned to Copenhagen from a 2-year trip that he took to Berlin, Heidelberg, Munich, Vienna, and Paris. On his trip, Martensen met most of the leading figures in Prussia and the German states who were discussing Hegel's philosophy at this time. When he returned to Copenhagen, Martensen immediately began an illustrious academic career. On July 12, 1837, he defended his dissertation, which was entitled On the Autonomy of Human Self-Consciousness. In this work, he critically treated the systems of the German thinkers Kant, Schleiermacher, and Hegel. Martensen argued that these philosophies all represented systems of autonomy that he believed focused one-sidedly on the power of the individual. According to Martensen, this fails to recognize the profound dependency of human beings on God. With this topic, Martensen can, in a sense, be said to anticipate Kierkegaard's topic of irony. In both cases, what's at issue is the role of the individual or the subject vis-a-vis the objective order of things. Both Martensen and Kierkegaard seem to be in agreement that modern subjectivity, or even relativism, has gone too far. Martensen's key term for this is modern autonomy, while Kierkegaard's is irony, but in the end, they're talking about the same set of issues. Martensen began lecturing at the University of Copenhagen in the fall of 1837. It was here at Regensens College that he defended his dissertation in the same year. His courses soon became the talk of the entire university. Students from all disciplines flocked to hear what he had to say, since he was, in a sense, giving an account of what he had learned on his trip about the most recent developments in philosophy and theology in the German-speaking states. To the consternation and amazement of the older, more conservative faculty, Martensen immediately became a kind of academic celebrity. To the students, he was an exciting young scholar who could speak to them in a way that they had not experienced before. He presented to them the basic ideas of the philosophy of Hegel, which all of Prussia and Germany was talking about. One of Martensen's students describes his encounter with these lectures as his intellectual awakening. He writes, I quote, "The man who through his lectures made such a strong impression on me and many others was a young instructor who had been appointed to give lectures on the recent history of philosophy for us first-year students. It was Hans Lassen Martensen. He brought new life into the new university building. Martensen, for many years, filled the largest auditoriums with nothing but zealous auditors. What immediately won me over to him was the fresh enthusiasm which surrounded him in comparison to the other instructors. He spoke precisely about what I thirsted to hear, and did so at times with a warmth which I found doubly impressive in the cold temple of the sciences." Among the students in Martensen's lecture hall was the young Søren Kierkegaard. His notes to Martensen's course can be found in his notebook 4. Here, Kierkegaard could witness firsthand the sensation that Hegel and German philosophy were making among his fellow students. He was vexed by Martensen's success and frustrated by the avid interest that his fellow students showed in these lectures. While Kierkegaard clearly felt alienated from the group of students that followed Martensen around, he knew that he had to take seriously the thought of Hegel if he was going to write a dissertation on irony, since Hegel had treated this topic in a handful of different texts. So he read carefully Hegel's lectures with a special eye to the different treatments of Socrates and Socratic irony. So why was Hegel so interesting to the students of Kierkegaard's generation? Hegel was born in Stuttgart in 1770, and he spent the last decade of his life at the Royal Friedrich Wilhelms University, which is today the Humboldt University in Berlin. His lectures there in the 1820s drew students from all over Europe. After he died on November 14, 1831, his students formed a society dedicated to publishing a complete edition of his works. They believed that Hegel's lectures constituted an important aspect of his thought, and so, in their edition, they decided to publish 4 series of his lectures along with the works that Hegel had published in his own lifetime. These were the lectures on the philosophy of religion, the lectures on aesthetics, the lectures on the philosophy of history, and finally, the lectures on the history of philosophy. Kierkegaard owned copies of all of these works, and in the concept of irony, he refers to or quotes directly 3 of the 4. Hegel's most extended account of Socrates appears in the first volume of the 3-volume Lectures on the History of Philosophy, which appeared from 1833 to 1836, edited by Hegel's student Carl Ludwig Michelet. We want to look at Hegel's analysis and see how it's relevant for Kierkegaard's understanding of Socrates in the concept of irony. In his investigation, Hegel makes use of the 3 main sources of Socrates' life and teachings: the philosopher Plato, the historian Xenophon, and the comic writer Aristophanes. These are the same 3 sources that Kierkegaard uses in his analysis of Socratic irony in the concept of irony. Why were people so interested in Hegel's philosophy? Was this simply the latest philosophical trend, or was there really something important about it that spoke to people at the time? In Hegel's lectures, he portrays Socrates as what he calls a mental turning point in the history of philosophy and culture. The Greek philosophers prior to Socrates, the so-called pre-Socratic philosophers, were concerned with understanding the world of nature. They were, in a sense, the first natural scientists who tried to give natural explanations of the world without appealing to any divine agency. They were thus primarily interested in the objective world as they found it outside themselves. By contrast, Socrates was the first to turn the focus inward to the realm of thought. While the other philosophers were concerned with explaining the natural phenomena in the world, they didn't problematize this issue of the way people thought. This is what Socrates did. He believed that understanding how people thought was prior to and more important than understanding the natural world. For in order to understand the natural world, we must first know what it is to understand something at all. According to Hegel, this marked a revolutionary idea, not just in Greek philosophy, but in Greek culture generally. The Greeks were accustomed to living in accordance with time-honored customs, habits that they took to be divinely sanctioned. This is the broad sphere of what Hegel calls in German Sittlichkeit, which is usually translated as ethics or ethical life. By this, however, he means not just the customary ethics that a given people like the Greeks follow, but also the broad spheres of religion, laws, traditions, and established patterns of social interaction. For Hegel, the Greeks believed that this objective sphere of customary ethics was true, as it were, by nature. In other words, when they acted in accordance with tradition and custom, this was not just the arbitrary will of some specific individual, but rather it was true in itself. This is the beginning of what is known today as the tradition of natural law, that is, the idea that some things are right or wrong by nature. According to Hegel, the conception of traditional ethical life can be seen in Sophocles' tragedy Antigone. In this work, a conflict arises between the young woman Antigone and the king of Thebes, Creon. Antigone's brother, Polynices, has been killed in a failed revolt against the state. Creon decrees that the bodies of the rebels should not be buried, but rather should be left exposed to the wild animals and the elements. Anyone caught trying to bury one of the rebels was punishable by death. Antigone regards this as an arbitrary decree of a single man, the tyrant Creon. This was just his personal opinion. The fact that he's the king and thus has the sanction of the law behind him doesn't change this. For Antigone, there's a higher law, namely the law of the family, the law that dictates that family members bury the dead of their deceased. In his lectures, Hegel quotes this work and refers to Antigone, who says that these are the eternal laws of the gods. For Antigone, the funeral rites are absolute, objective facts of nature that she must obey even if her action is illegal by human laws. The laws of nature are absolute, whereas human laws are arbitrary. Hegel takes this to be exemplary for the Greek view prior to Socrates. The revolution of thought that Socrates brought about was to shift this emphasis on the outward objective sphere that was given by the gods as true forever to the inward sphere of the individual. As Hegel explains, quote, Socrates' principle is that man must attain to truth through himself. So for Socrates, one should not accept blindly what custom and tradition teach. Instead, one must critically examine these things and come to a conclusion about them for oneself. But note that this doesn't mean that whatever the subject happens to think is true and has validity. Instead, Hegel believes that there's still an objective truth, but that it must be reached and recognized by the individual subject through rational examination. The problem with the Greek view prior to Socrates was that the sphere of accepted custom and tradition was, in a sense, tyrannical. This was claimed to be true in itself, and one's own personal opinion about it didn't matter. For Antigone, it's an absolute truth that the surviving family members must give the funeral rites to deceased relatives. It doesn't matter what Creon or anyone else thinks about this. It's simply true in and of itself. But for Socrates and for the modern view, each individual has the right to give his or her assent to the truth. This recognizes the rationality of the individual to know and understand the truth. So the revolution that Socrates began in the Greek world and that led to our modern conception is that the subject is a constitutive element of the truth. This was a revolution among the Greeks since it was a new and shocking idea, indeed, an idea that cost Socrates his life. The idea of a subjective truth was one that greatly appealed to the young Kierkegaard. In the summer of 1835, he came here to northern Sealand, to the north of Copenhagen, where he visited the small towns and villages at his leisure. He records his impressions from this short journey in his first journal, called simply Journal AA. This was an important period for the young student, Kierkegaard, who seemed not really to be making particularly rapid progress with his studies. One reason for this was perhaps that he was still somewhat unsure about what he wanted to do with his life. In the journal AA, he recounts some of his self-doubts and uncertainties about which course of life to take. On August the 1st, 1835, here in the fishing village of Gilleleie, he writes, "What I really need is to be clear about what I am to do, not what I must know. It's a question of understanding my destiny, of seeing what the deity really wants me to do. The thing is to find a truth, which is a truth for me, to find an idea for which I'm willing to live and die." Here, the young Kierkegaard states explicitly that he urgently needs to discover a subjective personal truth, as he says, a truth for me. Like Socrates, he rejects the objective truths that are accepted by society. He continues, "What use would it be in this respect if I were to discover a so-called objective truth, or if I worked my way through the philosopher's systems? And what use would it be in that respect to be able to work out a theory of the state, which I myself did not inhabit, but merely held up for others to see?" Here he rejects the objective knowledge that's recognized by the world. He acknowledges that this enjoys respect and recognition among people, but since it's objective, it lacks something fundamental. Thus, like Socrates, he wants to find a truth within himself. It's particularly interesting to note the way in which Kierkegaard also includes Christianity in his account of the objective truth. He writes, "What use would it be to be able to propound the meaning of Christianity, to explain many separate facts, if it had no deeper meaning for myself and my life?" Here he recognizes that Christianity can be regarded as something external and outward, as one objective truth among others. The academic fields of theology, such as dogmatics or church history, might be thought to fall into this category. For example, what some church council decided is an objective fact, but this has nothing to do with the individual's relation to Christianity. Like Socrates, Kierkegaard believes that the deeper truth is not the objective one, but rather the subjective one that lies within. He connects this directly with Socrates a few pages later. For Kierkegaard, as for Socrates, knowledge of external things is irrelevant without knowledge of oneself as subject. He writes, "One must first learn to know oneself before knowing anything else. Only when the person has inwardly understood himself and then sees the way forward on this path does his life acquire repose and meaning." Kierkegaard claims that one must first begin with skepticism or irony in order to work through it. He writes, "True knowing begins with a not knowing, Socrates." Kierkegaard refers to the way in which Socrates undermines traditional truths and begins from the start, or from a position of what he calls not knowing. Many years later, in 1846, in the concluding unscientific postscript, Kierkegaard develops this distinction in some detail. At the beginning of the work, he explains that the objective issue is about the truth of Christianity. This is the objective truth about Christianity, such as can be determined by, for example, the historical record, the sources, and so forth. In contrast to the objective truth, there's also the subjective, which is about the individual's relation to Christianity. The question of one's personal inward subjective relation to Christianity is for Kierkegaard a much deeper and more important truth than all of the external objective truths that can be established. This fundamental distinction between subjective and objective, for which the postscript is so well known, finds its origins in Kierkegaard's reflections here in Galilee in 1835, and these reflections are closely related to Socrates' revolution of thought that turned away from external custom and tradition and gave validity to what was inward and subjective. Hegel discusses Socrates' method and identifies two important features. First, Socrates goes out among different kinds of people in the context of their daily lives. He then strikes up a conversation with them about their occupations or interests. In this way, he manages to draw them into a discussion, since it's natural that people like to talk about their own interests. He then tries to get them to move from their immediate experience with specific individual cases to a universal truth. It's this movement, from particular to universal, that, according to Hegel, constitutes the first element of the Socratic method. We can see this in the dialogue The Euthyphro, where Euthyphro gives Socrates a number of examples of piety, that is, particular cases, and then Socrates asks what all of the particular cases have in common. So instead of hearing specific instances of piety, Socrates wants to find out what the essence or nature of piety is in itself. Likewise, in other dialogues, he's interested not in examples of beauty, but in beauty itself, not in examples of justice, but in justice itself, and so forth. The second element of the Socratic method is the causing of confusion between the idea or definition proposed and the actual experience of the individual, a conflict between the universal and the particular. Socrates' implicit goal is to show that his interlocutors have unreflectively accepted certain things to be true without examining them carefully. Thus, by pointing out the contradictions in their views, Socrates, in effect, calls on the individual to go back and examine them critically. The key is that the individual, with his or her own reason, must test whatever is claimed to be true. Hegel also examines Socratic irony. What was so important for Kierkegaard? He explains that Socrates begins by getting his interlocutor to say something about the topic based on the generally accepted understanding of things. In order to get the other person to do this, Socrates pretends that he himself is ignorant of the matter in question and requires some instruction in it. Once the other person begins to set forth the accepted view, Socrates can go to work on it and demonstrate the contradictions involved in it. In this way, Socrates believed that he was helping the other person to come to the realization that he knew nothing. A key question about Socrates' use of irony is whether or not Socrates really means it when he says that he knows nothing and is thus in need of instruction. In other words, is this ironic, or does Socrates really mean this, since he's truly convinced that he knows nothing? One might be suspicious of his claim to know nothing, since, after all, in the course of the ensuing discussion, he clearly shows much greater intellectual acumen than his interlocutor. He's constantly giving examples of what seem to betray knowledge of specific things, or quoting texts, for example, Homer, which shows great knowledge. Or, at a minimum, he seems to have knowledge of forms of argumentation, since he's so effective at pointing out flaws in reasoning. But Hegel says, and I quote, "It may actually be said that Socrates knew nothing, for he did not reach the systematic construction of a philosophy." Here, Hegel refers to the idea of aporia, that is, the fact that the dialogues like the Euthyphro do not end up with any positive result. This would seem to prove the claim that Socrates really doesn't know anything. This would imply that the irony consists not in this claim, which, after all, is true, but rather in the feigned belief that his interlocutor knows the truth and can teach it to him. Hegel points out that when we use universal terms such as truth, justice, and beauty, we all have some vague sense of what these mean, And because of this, we can communicate with each other by means of language, which makes use of such terms. But each of us has different intuitions about what these terms mean. And so in order to determine their meaning more exactly, we need to analyze them in more detail. This is what Socrates' method tries to do. By means of irony, Socrates attempts to get his interlocutor to make the given concept concrete, or as Hegel says, to develop it, so that it ceases to be vague and abstract. Hegel also mentions maeutics, or the art of midwifery, as an important element of Socrates' method. According to his interpretation, this amounts to the production of the universal from the particulars. The inexperienced or untrained mind lives in the world of immediate perception, the world of particular sense perceptions and impressions. But these particulars necessarily imply a universal, for otherwise we wouldn't know what the particulars are. For example, one sees a number of particular dogs, but one wouldn't be able to recognize them as dogs if one didn't have the universal idea of dog in one's mind. A category is necessary for us to put individual things into. So when Socrates is practicing his maeutics, or art of midwifery, he's helping the individuals to reach or recover the universal, which lies implicitly in their own minds. For Hegel, this is a kind of educational process that takes place in every person as they grow. We begin in the world of perceptions and particular cases, examples and images, and only later can we learn to think abstractly and talk about abstract ideas and universals. The idea of Socratic maeutics was also of central importance to Kierkegaard, who regarded himself as practicing the maeeutic art. He wanted to get his fellow Danes to reflect on their relation to Christianity, but this wasn't something that he could preach to them or argue for in any objective or discursive manner. Rather, it was a subjective truth that lay in the heart of each individual. His goal was simply to help individuals to bring this forth in their own inner truth or idea for themselves. We are accustomed to think of these two ideas as absolutely independent of one another, being exists independently on its own and has nothing to do with nothingness. And vice versa, when we think of nothingness, this is a concept that exists on its own, independent of the concept of being. Thus both terms, being and nothing, are thought to be isolated, independent, and irreducible. Indeed, being contradicts nothing and vice versa. Where the one exists, the other does not. But, Hegel argues, when we examine these concepts more closely, we realize we can't think the concept of being without the concept of nothing, and vice versa. The one necessarily implies the other. Thus, instead of being two isolated atomic concepts, these in fact constitute a single higher complex concept, becoming. Becoming contains both being and nothing. Something becomes when it comes into being, and it equally becomes when it perishes and ceases to be. In this way, from what initially appeared to be an irresolvable contradiction, there emerges a new positive concept. The movement looked initially as if it were stuck in contradiction and negation, as if it were aporetic, the contradiction of being and nothing. But ultimately, this proved only to be a passing stage, and in the end, something positive and constructive resulted. This is a fundamental idea in Hegel's metaphysics. The concept of negation is not simply a non-starter, but rather forms the foundation for a positive development. So Hegel's critical of Socrates for not going further and developing his method to include this positive development. Instead, the Socratic method stops with negation. But this is precisely what attracted Kierkegaard to Socrates. The Greek philosopher didn't try to go on and develop something positive, but intentionally remained in the negative, in the contradictory. Kierkegaard constantly criticizes, among others, Martensen's zealous students for their desire to go further, or specifically to go further than Socrates. This criticism has its origin in this point in Hegel. For Hegel, Socrates prepared the ground for philosophy by means of negation. He cleared away the mistaken beliefs so that philosophy could go to work from the ground up. But Socrates himself never got past the negation. He failed to recognize the positive dimension of the dialectic. Thus, what was needed was to go beyond Socrates and supply the positive element, and thus begin to construct a philosophical position or theory. But for Kierkegaard, the whole point with Socrates was negation, and all talk of going beyond was an absurdity. Socrates tries to define the good, that is, the abstract concept of the good. According to Hegel, his great contribution in the development of human thought is the realization that the good must be developed by the individual and can't simply be blindly accepted as given by one's culture, established tradition, family, etc. But this doesn't mean that Socrates is a relativist like the Sophists. Hegel cites the famous saying from the Sophist Protagoras, "Man is the measure of all things." For Hegel, this means that each individual has his or her own truth. This is a statement of relativism. By contrast, for Socrates, the good is something absolute and universal, even though there's a subjective element involved in it. So again, Socrates must be disassociated from the Sophists and from simple relativism. The revolutionary dimension of Socrates' thought was that he introduced reflective morality in contrast to the established morality or ethics. Reflective morality involved the individuals consciously considering for themselves what was good instead of merely accepting it uncritically from their parents, ancestors, or society. For Hegel, this marked a major historical shift that set off an entirely new movement of thought that continues to this very day. He writes, I quote, "In the universal consciousness, in the spirit of the people to which Socrates belongs, we see the natural turn to reflective morality. The spirit of the world here begins to change, a change which was later on carried to its completion." But, like most revolutionary movements, this one was frightening to the people at the time. For the Greeks, prior to Socrates, ethics was always an established matter in traditions, customs, and the state. The individual's reflection on this, or assent to this, played no role. But then came Socrates, who began to ask critical questions about these kinds of things, and to assert the importance of the individual. For the Greeks, this was a terrifying thing, since it threatened to undermine all of the traditions, customs, and truths that they had always held most dear. Thus, Socrates was regarded not just as something of a nuisance, but rather as a real and serious threat to Greek life. Now, for Socrates, morality is not about some pre-established fixed outward fact, for example, the state, duties, moral laws, etc., but rather the inwardness of each individual. What was universal, the truth of ethics, was formerly thought to be visible in the outward sphere of the state and society. Now, however, Socrates claims that it's to be sought inwardly in the individual. This is a radical new thought. One can no longer be complacent about morality and simply adopt what custom and tradition dictated. Now, each individual must be critical and reflective and enter upon his or her own journey in order to reach the truth of ethics. While this Socratic revolution is destructive since it spells the demise of public morality, it's also a liberation since it frees people from the tyranny of custom. One no longer needs to go along with custom simply because it is custom. Now, one can call custom and tradition into question and reject aspects of them that one can't assent to. This is the modern principle that Socrates initiated in antiquity. The criticism of public morality can be seen as consistent with Socrates' claim that he doesn't teach anything. With regard to ethics and morals, nothing can be learned that comes from the outside. This is the entire sphere of public morality which, so to speak, imposes itself from without. Hegel uses the example of impressing a stamp of wax to illustrate the way in which we learn public morality when we're young. But this is not what's essential about ethics. On the contrary, what's essential is the inward dimension. Here, individuals must do the work for themselves. They must find the truth of ethics inwardly. This is what Socrates helps them to find, so to speak, as a midwife. But he doesn't teach anything or provide anything positive himself. By focusing on the subject, Socrates seemed to be like the Sophists, who didn't recognize any absolute or external truth. Instead, they were thought to be relativists who created eloquent arguments for whatever positions happened to suit their particular contingent interests. According to this view, there was no objective truth beyond the subjective opinions of the individual. But Socrates is keen to distinguish himself from the sophists. He's no relativist, even though he too wants to focus on the importance of the subject. In contrast to the sophists, for Socrates, there is still an objective truth, but the key is that it must be reached by the individual by means of rationality and critical reflection. As Hegel puts it, for Socrates, man has this outside within him. The objective truth is not simply to be found in the external sphere around us, but rather also in the minds of each individual. So while the sophists use critical reflection to justify their own arbitrary, self-serving claims, Socrates believes that this tool can be used to reach an objective truth that can be agreed upon by everyone. With Socrates, there's a move from the outward to the inward, but the notion of truth is always maintained. Hegel calls this the unity of the subjective and the objective. The individual must seek the truth or the universal of ethics in him or herself by means of thought and reason. But thought and reason are universals that other rational people can also attain. In this sense, ethics is also something outward and public. So Hegel claims that there is a unity between the inward universal and the outward universal. While the two can be in contradiction, they can also align and be in agreement. Insofar as the subjective side is also based on rationality, it's not just about one's inward whims or moods. Hegel explains, and I quote now, Socrates opposed to the contingent and particular inward that universal true inward of thought. And Socrates awakened this real conscience, for he not only said that man is the measure of all things, but man as thinking is the measure of all things. So the sophists are relativists, since subjectivity means for them the contingency of the individual, that is, feelings, whims, moods, and so forth. But for Socrates, subjectivity and inwardness is about thought. And since thought is about universals, it is also something that can connect us with others and with an objective truth. Hegel gives an intriguing interpretation of the daimon of Socrates. He points out that the daimon is different from Socrates' own will and intelligence. It often tells him not to do things that he might otherwise have been inclined to do. Hegel draws the analogy between the daimon, which Socrates consulted in important personal matters, and the oracle at Delphi, which the Greeks consulted in important matters of state. Hegel explains, however, that the difference is that the oracle is public, that is, it's openly available and objective. By contrast, Socrates' daimonic oracle is inward. It's as if he has within himself his own personal oracle that speaks only to him. It was this idea that offended the religious sensibilities of his fellow Athenians. For the Greeks, the laws and customs were sanctioned by the gods. They were not personal or subjective decisions of individuals. Rather, the individual played no role here whatsoever. Similarly, when a weighty decision had to be made about a course of action, either in one's private affairs or in a matter of state or the community, it was thought that this was not a matter for any private individual to decide, but rather this was something that only the gods could determine. Thus, the Greeks could send an embassy to the oracle or perform religious ceremonies to determine what the will of the gods was. The idea here is that such things are far too important for any finite individual to decide about. The Greeks didn't possess what Hegel calls subjective freedom. That is, the idea that the individual has the right to decide for him or herself about important matters. It thus struck the Greeks as highly arrogant and inappropriate when a specific individual claimed to be able to make such decisions for himself, and when he claimed to have his own personal oracle that no one else could see or hear. This is precisely what Socrates seemed to be doing by asserting the authority of his daimon above traditional law and custom. According to Hegel, Socrates' daimon represents a position midway between the externality of the oracle and the inwardness of the human mind of the individual. It's a transitional form from objective to subjective morality. On the one hand, the daimon is something inner and not something outer like the oracle at Delphi. It's as if the oracle had been transferred from the objective external sphere to the inward sphere of the person of Socrates. This outraged his fellow Athenians, since he seemed thereby to place his own personal opinion above the word of the oracle. But on the other hand, although the daimon is something inward within him, it's not identical with the will of Socrates himself. The daimon opposes Socrates when he wants to do something that's ill-advised. So Socrates' own subjective will leads him in one direction, but the daimon contradicts this and leads him in another. In this sense, the daimon, although something inward in Socrates himself, is also something outward and distinct from his will. It's an external authority that corrects his will and advises him about what to do. In this sense, the daimon marks a midway point. It's not objectively external like the oracle, nor is it a straightforward affirmation of his subjective will. According to Hegel, the daimon can be seen as a movement from the external to the internal, but the movement is not yet complete. Socrates represents the great revolution of thought that shows the infinite and irreducible value of the subjective. But no revolution begins and ends in a single day. Socrates marked the beginning of it, but the subsequent course of history has had to develop it further. Socrates was not yet in a position to present and defend his own private will as a truth, and so he had recourse to the daimon, which pointed to the subjective and the inward side of his personality, but stopped short of being identical with his will. Only in the modern world have we reached the point where we celebrate the truth and validity of the will of the individual, but it took the course of more than 2,000 years of cultural and historical development after Socrates to reach this point. Socrates only began the revolutionary movement, but he did not finish it. Soren Kierkegaard was interested in Socrates because the Greek philosopher, he believed, represented something important about modern life. Socrates represented the rights of the individual against the voice of established custom and tradition. Socrates asked people to question their accepted beliefs and to look within themselves for the truth. This caused a conflict to arise between Socrates and the Athenian state. It seemed to some that what Socrates was doing was seditious, since by questioning the time-honored beliefs and institutions of Athens, he seemed to be undermining its very foundation. This conflict resulted in a trial and condemnation of Socrates in 399 BC. In The Concept of Irony, Kierkegaard examined the account of this trial in Plato's work, The Apology. Kierkegaard largely draws on Hegel's account of these same events in his lectures on the history of philosophy, and so it's there that we need to start. In his account of the trial of Socrates, Hegel refers to the historian of philosophy, Wilhelm Gottlieb Tennemann, who was also one of Kierkegaard's most important sources for ancient philosophy. For Hegel, Tennemann represents a prevailing view of the day, namely the idea that Socrates was a morally righteous and upstanding person, and that his condemnation was a gross injustice that showed the way in which the rabble or factions can exercise power in democracies. For years, Socrates had been lionized in this manner by scholars sympathetic to him. Hegel finds this view naive, since it fails to understand the important revolutionary role of Socrates in Greek society. The first charge leveled against Socrates is that he didn't honor the national gods of Athens, but instead introduced new gods. This refers to Socrates' claim to have a daimon. To the Greek mind, Socrates was in a sense claiming to replace the oracle with his own private self-consciousness. He seemed to be placing his personal opinion and views above that of the god. This was outrageous to the Greeks of the day. The famous saying, "Know thyself," meant for Socrates that each individual must look within him or herself to discover what's true. This implied that one should disregard the traditional public morality that was sanctioned by the gods. This public morality was found in the external sphere, since it was accessible to all. Socrates seemed to be denying the validity of this and encouraging the individual to look not outwardly for the truth, but inwardly. According to Hegel's view, these were revolutionary ideas. The notion of a personal daimon in contrast to the oracle or the gods of the state indeed amounted to the introduction of a new god. Hegel concludes that on this score, Socrates is indeed guilty as charged. The second charge is that Socrates corrupted the youth. This charge refers to the claim that Socrates led the son of a certain Antius to disobey him by telling the son that he was fit for something better than the profession that his father had planned for him. Antaeus was a tanner by trade, and this kind of handiwork was regarded as menial labor among the Greeks. Anytus had planned for his son to follow him in this profession, but the son was reluctant to do so since, with Socrates' encouragement, he felt that being a tanner was beneath him and that he had talents and intellect that made him suited for much more prestigious jobs. Hegel believes that, based on the testimony, this charge was also well-founded. He points out that in Greek society at the time, the bond between parents and their children was something sacred. Obedience to one's parents was among the highest of values. Socrates had undermined this by encouraging Antaeus' son in the idea that he, in his role as an individual with specific gifts and talents, was more important than in his role as a son with clearly defined obligations and duties. While in our modern world, we're not offended by Socrates' actions, since we too value the importance of the individual. In ancient Athens, this was a serious breach of ethics and custom. Today, we too believe that no one should be forced against one's will into a job or trade that one doesn't want simply because that's what one's family or culture demands. This too was a part of the revolution that Socrates stood for. It placed the individual above established custom and tradition. Hegel also analyzes the final episode of the trial of Socrates, where, after the defendant is found guilty and given a preliminary sentence, he's able to propose an alternative punishment. This procedure allows the jury to be merciful if they see a degree of contrition on the part of the defendant. By proposing an alternative penalty, the convicted person thereby acknowledges his guilt and recognizes the legitimacy and authority of the court. But Socrates, in effect, made sport of the situation by apparently ironically proposing that he be given free meals and be supported financially by the state for the public service that he was providing. According to Hegel, by doing this, Socrates refuses to acknowledge the validity of the court's decision and thus his own guilt. Here again, Hegel finds Socrates' position problematic. No state can allow individuals to put themselves above the law or to judge themselves solely based on their own private views in opposition or contradiction to established customs, traditions, and laws of society. Given this, it's hardly surprising that the Athenians lost their patience with Socrates and stuck with the original sentence of the death penalty. When Hegel claims that Socrates was indeed guilty of the charges raised against him, his point isn't that he has no sympathy or understanding for Socrates in this situation, but rather he's saying that when seen from the historical perspective, given the traditions and values of Greek society at the time, the charges against Socrates were well-founded. Hegel explains the conflict as follows, quote, "The spirit of the Athenians in itself, its constitution, its whole life rested on a moral ground, on religion, and could not exist without this absolutely secure basis. Thus, because Socrates makes the truth rest on the judgment of inward consciousness, he enters upon a struggle with the Athenian people as to what is right and true." So what Socrates was doing was undermining the traditions and public morality and values of the state. Socrates set off a revolution that led to the recognition of the individual as something absolute and irreducible. In this sense, he's the forerunner of some of the values that we hold most dear today. But it's natural that, from our modern perspective, we find him a sympathetic figure. Hegel reminds us, however, that this shouldn't make us lose sight of the radicality of Socrates' message in his own time. Some people might ask why this set of issues that Hegel addresses in connection with his interpretation of Socrates is so important. Perhaps from a purely historical perspective, it's of passing interest to try to see how Hegel understood Socrates and how Kierkegaard understood them both. But what if we're not particularly interested in the history of philosophy for its own sake? How are these issues relevant for us today? Who really cares about Hegel's concept of subjective freedom or Socrates' undermining of Greek customary values? What fascinated both Hegel and Kierkegaard was that they recognized in this story of Socrates' conflict with Greek society an important forerunner of the problems of modernity. In other words, Socrates' story is not just that of Athens in the 5th century BC, but it's the story of modern existence. In this course, we have online students from all over the world: Africa, Asia, the Middle East, the Americas, and also here in Europe. You've all grown up in different countries with different languages, customs, religions, and family practices. In addition, you all have grown up in a world that's rapidly changing, and these changes have often led to conflicts in traditional customs and practices. Let me ask each of you to think about this in the context of your own country and culture. Are there, for example, controversial issues in your country about the role of the individual and traditional demands of the culture? In many places throughout the world, including here in Europe, there are conflicts about exactly this kind of thing. Some people find it objectionable that young men are obliged to follow in the profession of their fathers, or that women are obliged to cover their hair in public, or that parents prearrange the marriages of their children, or that certain classes of people are forbidden from doing certain kinds of work. We find it objectionable when people are coerced to follow the crowd when it means acting against their own conscience. It's said that practices of this sort encroach on the freedom of the individual. For Hegel, this is what the concept of subjective freedom is all about. He believes that there's something infinite, something unique and irreducible about each and every individual that should be respected. Each person as an individual should be granted the right to use their rationality to consent to the practices and values that they inherit from their culture. It's also the right of the individual to be able to critically evaluate their inherited culture with their faculty of reason. The birth of subjective freedom was a major turning point in world history, but the revolution of freedom continues to this day as we try to negotiate the difficult relation between the rights of the individual and the society and tradition. Here we can see that the issues that Hegel is attentive to in Socrates are in fact of central importance in our world today. Kierkegaard took this idea of subjective freedom from Hegel and developed it in his own way to a theory of the individual in the context of both society and religion. As was the case with Hegel, Kierkegaard's interest in Socrates was not purely or primarily historical, but rather Socrates is a symbol of the constellation of modern problems that concern freedom, alienation, and relativism, the problems of our world today.